Hi, welcome back to my garden. For some strange reason, this week I thought about, just popped into my head, a book that I haven't read. The book in question is What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. I think that's the title. By the Japanese novelist Haruki Murakami. It's not a novel, it is actually a book about running. He is a passionate runner, a very interesting man. He's a jazz bar owner in Japan, and then later on in life became a writer, a quite astonishing novelist. Now, I haven't read this book, but I have read many of his novels, and they are wonderful. I'm a big fan. Although it's quite hard to explain why. I mean, not just why I'm a big fan, actually why I like the books. In a way, I sometimes feel I shouldn't like the books. They are very peculiar. The sort of noir fiction, sort of American hard-boiled detective type things, written about emotional, psychological content in a style of South American magical realism. Really shouldn't work, but for me it does, and for many other people, a highly acclaimed writer. But I haven't read his book about his passion for running. Of course, when he says what I talk about when I talk about running, he's not just talking about running. Although, as I understand it, with a little bit of background research, when I went down a work avoidance rabbit hole, I think he wrote this while he was training for the New York Marathon. And the book is as much a book about writing and the writing process as it is about running and training for running. And it's also a book about life and philosophy and everything in between. It's one I'd like to read, but as I say, I don't have a copy, and well, maybe one day. What it got me thinking about, that's a bit of a longer intro than I planned, but aren't they always? What it got me thinking about is the power of analogy as a means of thought. That very often it helps us, if we want to think or talk about something, to think or talk about something else, which is quite strange when you think about it. And it's not the only way we go about the thought process. Another way, I suppose, would be what I do when I play chess, or when people play games like chess, which is a sort of analytical, if I go here, where will they go? If I do this, what happens next? What's my opponent planning to do? A sort of blow by blow, strategic type of thinking. I'm sure there's other ways of thinking, but besides analogy and sort of mathematical analysis. But those are certainly two very good ways of going about it. And as rational people, I suppose many of us are drawn to thinking and explaining our thinking in that sort of blow by blow, joined up, linear sort of way. Of course, I'm talking about a conscious type of thinking. I suppose, again, a book that I haven't read, perhaps that's the linking thread in this week's video. In Thinking Fast and Slow by the Nobel Prize winning behavioral economist, is that what you call him? Daniel Kahneman. He talks about type 1 and type 2 thinking, as I understand it. As I say, I haven't actually read the book. And I suppose this rational, slow, join the dots thinking is very much type 2, and type 1, perhaps, if I remember rightly from the little bits I gleaned of the documentaries floating around talking about the book, I suppose type 1 is a more impulsive or intuitive sort of thinking. Not thinking, just acting or doing. First thing that pops into your head. But when we're doing this slow thinking, I think it's common to view it in this linear sort of paradigm. But the analogy, of course, is very, very helpful. We perhaps use it more frequently when we're explaining. It's like, think about that, but actually, think about that leads me on to what struck me earlier in the week when I wasn't distracted by the book I haven't actually read, was an idea about this process of self-actualization, of psychological, spiritual, intellectual self-improvement, personal development, all that sort of stuff. That perhaps if you're trying to get to grips with it, an interesting experiment is to not think about how we develop ourselves, let's say, psychologically, spiritually, intellectually, but think about how we develop ourselves, what is necessary in the physical realm, where it's perhaps slightly more clear-cut. And then once we have an idea about that, we can simply map it on. I love using my maths word, isomorphisms. We sort of map the one structure, the one thought process, the one chain of argument from one area into the other. And if you're struggling in one area, perhaps finding that easier way, solving the problem over there, might be helpful. So I started doing that when I was wandering around my gallery. And I've been doing that quite a lot because the large head study is pretty much done, bar one small area that needs working on, and for that to happen I need to move it, and so I'm kind of pottering around on the sculptural front and getting distracted very easily, and now I'm using my distraction explanation to distract myself from the real meat and potatoes. So get on with it, Neil, get back to the point. Yes, so I started thinking about, well, physical development, what do we need to maintain and even progress ourselves, to flourish physically? Well, we need exercise, and in order to carry out that exercise, movement, motion successfully, we need feeding, watering, and we need to rest as well. And the moment I thought about it in those terms, it certainly makes it very easy to pinpoint at least an initial impression on any topic in a more amorphous, sort of nebulous world of self-improvement on a psychological or spiritual level, and how we might develop ourselves in our path towards self-actualization. So the parallels just immediately spring to mind. I'll give you an example. You start thinking about the life hacks and how they might work, and then you start thinking, well, what would a life hack be in physical well-being? It might be a crash diet or a fad diet. I haven't mentioned stories from my past, but this one's it's just literally popped in my mind now, and you can see I'm laughing about it because it really was funny. When I worked in Peru, there was a chap who shall go nameless. He was an English teacher at one of the schools, and he was extraordinarily fat, enormous man, quite a character, very popular. He had a dry, droll sense of humour. But boy, he was maybe a little about my height, maybe a bit taller, I don't know, maybe a bit shorter. But he must have been north of 150 kilograms, easily. And I remember at some point, somehow it floated into a conversation, and he was talking about his current attempt at dieting, at losing weight, and someone asked him, what diet are you following? He said, the cheese diet. I kind of looked at him like, are you out of your mind? And he said, no, it's, I read about it. I like cheese and I don't like dieting. So I thought this might actually work. He said, well, how does it operate? What do you do? He said, well, you just eat cheese. He says, is it working? He said, no. and he, this is a made-up memory, not what I remember at all. But he might have said, it's not working because I've discovered I have an extraordinary capacity to just eat cheese. And sure enough, it didn't work. And then he moved on to the next fad that failed. If you take this kind of concept of extraordinary, bizarre diets, and every now and then one of them will bubble up. All sorts of people will follow them. There will be information about it, jam-packed full of testimonials about how it worked. And even when the testimonials are true, they give you an idea that it might have worked in the short term, but how did that pan out over a longer time frame? And so, thinking about, for example, fad diets, it's easy to think about our dime a dozen YouTube self-improvement life hacks. Just do this and everything will fall into place. Why? Well, I've done it and it did. Or so-and-so who's incredibly successful and famous said they did it, and look at them, they're famous, therefore it works. This is all nonsense. And I'm using a fairly simple example, and of course you could reach that conclusion without making or having recourse to thinking by analogy. But in more complex situations, perhaps thinking by analogy might be an interesting way forward. And certainly if you're trying to get a big picture, view of your own sort of psychological, spiritual, intellectual well-being, think sort of mapping out the different components that would go into good physical well-being, and then saying, well, what would the equivalent be in more all-round life terms, and how am I faring there? Something like that, a sort of a constructed framework that will allow you to dig into the analysis. Anyway, that's what I thought about this week. Random, bizarre, as always. Helpful, I don't know. Will I sit down and do this exercise myself? Well, I might. I might not. I'll see how next week plays out. Till then, let me know what you think, and as always, I trust your lives are filled with joy. And that's it for this week. So, ciao from a sunny Brazil.